The mansion's secret. The marble corridors of the Whitmore estate had witnessed countless dramas over the decades, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold on that crisp autumn afternoon. The mansion, with its towering columns and pristine white facade, stood as a testament to old money and older secrets. Secrets that were about to shatter the lives of everyone within its walls. Part 1. The perfect life. Victoria Whitmore had always been the picture of elegance and grace. At 32, she possessed the kind of beauty that made heads turn at charity galas and society functions. Her golden hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, and her emerald green dress hugged her figure in a way that spoke of expensive taste and careful maintenance. The diamond necklace at her throat, a family heirloom worth more than most people's homes, caught the light as she moved through the estate that had been in her family for 3 generations. She had married Richard Whitmore 5 years ago, a union that had been celebrated in all the society pages. He was handsome, successful, and came from a family almost as prestigious as her own. Their wedding had been the event of the season, with 500 guests, an orchestra flown in from Vienna, and champagne that cost more per bottle than the average monthly salary. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple. Victoria hosted fundraisers, sat on the boards of several charities, and smiled beautifully for the cameras. Richard ran the family's investment firm, a business that had weathered economic storms for over a century. They lived in the sprawling mansion with its 30 rooms, manicured gardens, and staff that moved through the halls like well-trained ghosts. But perfection, Victoria had learned, was often just a carefully maintained illusion. Part 2. The suspicions. It had started 6 months ago with small things. Richard coming home later than usual, his explanations growing more elaborate and less believable. The phone calls he would take in his study with the door closed. The way he had become distant, his mind clearly elsewhere even when they sat across from each other at dinner in their grand dining room. Victoria had tried to ignore it at first. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the stress of managing the estate and her various charitable obligations was making her imagine problems where none existed. But the signs kept accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon. There were receipts for restaurants she had never been to. Charges on credit card statements for jewelry she had never received. Late nights that became overnight business trips. And through it all, Richard's eyes, once so warm when they looked at her, had grown cold and evasive. She had hired a private investigator 3 months ago, a discreet professional who came highly recommended by a friend who had been through a similar situation. The evidence he had gathered sat in a manila envelope in her bedroom safe, a collection of photographs and reports that confirmed what her heart had already known. Richard was having an affair. But it wasn't just any affair. What made it worse, so much worse, was who he was having it with. Part 3. Maria's story. Maria Gonzalez had been working at the Whitmore estate for 2 years. She had come to America from a small village in Mexico, drawn by the promise of opportunity and the chance to send money home to her family. Her mother was sick, her younger siblings needed education, and the wages she could earn in the United States, even as domestic help, were several times what she could make back home. She was 28 years old, with striking features and dark hair that she kept pulled back in a practical bun. The uniform she wore, a traditional maid's outfit with a black dress, white apron, and cap, was something she had initially found uncomfortable, even demeaning. In her village, she had been a teacher. But here, she cleaned toilets and made beds, invisible to the wealthy people whose homes she maintained. Maria had been grateful for the job when Mrs. Whitmore had hired her. The pay was fair, better than many other households, and Victoria had always treated her with a basic level of respect. Not warmth, exactly. There was always that distance between employer and employee, but civility at least. She had never intended for anything to happen with Richard. In fact, she had actively tried to avoid him in the early months of her employment. She knew the stories, had heard warnings from other domestic workers about men in positions of power who saw their employees as available for their entertainment, but Richard had been persistent. It started with compliments about her work, then questions about her life, her family, her dreams. He seemed genuinely interested in a way that no one else in this cold, vast house ever was. He would find reasons to be in whatever room she was cleaning. He learned Spanish to speak with her in her own language. He asked about her mother's illness and arranged for a specialist in Mexico City to see her. All expenses paid. Maria had resisted for months, but loneliness and his relentless charm had eventually worn down her defenses. She knew it was wrong. She knew it would end badly. But for a few stolen moments, in his arms, she felt seen and valued in a way she hadn't since leaving her home. She had recently discovered, 3 months pregnant. Part 4. The confrontation. The moment Victoria had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure finally arrived on a Thursday afternoon. She had sent most of the staff away on various errands, ensuring that only Maria would be in the house when she executed her plan. Richard was supposed to be returning from a business lunch, one of his increasingly transparent excuses. Victoria positioned herself in the grand entrance hall, with its soaring ceiling and checkerboard marble floor. She had dressed carefully for this confrontation, choosing the green dress because Richard had once told her she looked like a goddess in it. She wanted him to see what he was throwing away. She heard the front door open and Richard's footsteps echoing through the hall. He stopped when he saw her, and she watched the color drain from his face. He knew. Somehow. He knew that she knew. "Victoria," he began, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Don't," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Don't insult me with more lies." At that moment, as if choreographed by some cruel cosmic director, Maria emerged from one of the side corridors. She froze when she saw them, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach in a protective gesture that Victoria noticed immediately. "No," Victoria whispered, the implications of that simple movement crashing over her like a wave. "No. Tell me you didn't. Tell me she's not." Maria's eyes filled with tears, and that was all the confirmation Victoria needed. Her carefully maintained composure shattered. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, the kind of noise that comes from a soul breaking in real time. "How long?" Victoria demanded, turning to Richard. "How long has this been going on?" Richard's silence was damning. He stood there in his expensive suit, looking for all the world like he wanted to disappear. The man who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions was reduced to speechless paralysis by the consequences of his own actions. Victoria turned to Maria, studying the young woman she had welcomed into her home. Maria couldn't meet her eyes, shame evident in every line of her body. The feather duster she had been holding fell to the marble floor with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the tension-filled silence. I'm so sorry, Maria finally whispered, her accent thick with emotion. Mrs. Whitmore, I am so sorry. I never wanted. This was never supposed to happen. But it did happen, Victoria said, her voice taking on a hard edge. You slept with my husband. In my home. Under my roof. While I paid your wages and provided you with a job and security. And now you're carrying his child. Part 5. The unraveling what followed was not a single conversation but an excruciating series of revelations, each one more painful than the last. They moved to the sitting room. Victoria insisted, unwilling to have this discussion in the entrance hall where any returning staff member might witness it. And there, the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Richard, it turned out, had been unhappy in the marriage for years. He felt trapped by expectations, by the weight of family obligations, by a life that had been mapped out for him since birth. Maria represented freedom, authenticity, a life uncomplicated by social obligations and ancestral responsibilities. She sees me, Richard said at one point, a statement that cut Victoria deeper than any confession of physical betrayal could have. She sees who I really am, not who I'm supposed to be. Victoria wanted to rage at him, to ask what he thought marriage was if not the daily choice to see and honor each other. But she found herself speechless, the enormity of the situation rendering her usual eloquence useless. Maria sat perched on the edge of a chair, looking like she might bolt at any moment. Her story emerged in fragments. The initial resistance, the gradual wearing down, the false promises Richard had made about leaving Victoria, about building a new life together. She had believed him because she wanted to, because believing made the guilt easier to bear. He said you didn't love him anymore, Maria said quietly. He said the marriage was just for show, that you both had separate lives. He made it sound like I wasn't breaking anything because there was nothing left to break. Victoria closed her eyes against fresh tears. She had been unhappy too, she realized. Somewhere along the way, their marriage had become a performance, a carefully maintained facade for the benefit of society pages and family expectations. When had they stopped being real with each other? When had the distance between them grown so vast that he could convince himself, and someone else, that their marriage was already over? But knowing that didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. Understanding the why didn't ease the pain of the what. Part 6. The consequences. In the days that followed, the carefully ordered world of the Whitmore estate came apart at the seams. Victoria moved into the guest wing of the mansion, unable to bear being in the suite she had shared with Richard. She called her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman who had handled her family's legal affairs for decades, and began the process of filing for divorce. Richard moved out entirely, taking a suite at the Four Seasons while he figured out his next steps. The investment firm was in an uproar. News of the scandal had leaked despite their best efforts to contain it, and the board was pressuring him to step down to avoid damaging the company's reputation. Maria found herself in the most precarious position of all. Victoria, in a moment of spite that she would later regret, had fired her immediately. But without a work visa and with a baby on the way, her options were severely limited. She couldn't return to Mexico. Her family depended on the money she sent home. But finding another job while pregnant and without references seemed impossible. It was Victoria's mother, Elizabeth, who finally intervened. At 75, Elizabeth had seen enough of life to know that situations were rarely as simple as they appeared. She arrived at the mansion 3 days after the initial confrontation, took one look at her daughter's devastated face, and set about trying to mitigate the damage. "Fire the girl if you must," Elizabeth told Victoria over tea in the conservatory. "God knows she deserves it. But think about the child. That baby is innocent in all of this. And legally, that child has rights to the Whitmore estate." Victoria hadn't thought that far ahead, too consumed by her own pain to consider the long-term implications. But her mother was right. If Maria had Richard's child, that child would be an heir to the Whitmore fortune, entitled to a portion of the family wealth. The legal complications alone would be staggering. "What do you suggest?" Victoria asked wearily. "Think strategically," Elizabeth replied. "This situation is a disaster, but disasters can be managed. You need to decide what you want the outcome to be and work backwards from there." Part 7. Difficult decisions. Over the next few weeks, Victoria found herself forced to make choices she had never imagined facing. Her lawyer laid out the options with clinical precision. A straightforward divorce would be messy but achievable. Richard had been the one who strayed, which would work in her favor. But the pregnancy complicated everything. If Richard acknowledged the child and provided support, the baby would have legal standing as his heir. If he didn't, if he abandoned Maria and the child, Victoria could potentially use that to paint him as even more of a villain in divorce proceedings. But either way, that innocent child would exist, would grow up knowing that their father had destroyed a marriage, that their very existence was the product of betrayal. Victoria met with Maria one last time, at a coffee shop far from the neighborhood where anyone might recognize them. The young woman looked terrible. Dark circles under her eyes, her uniform replaced by worn jeans and a sweater that had seen better days. Without her job, she was staying with a friend in a tiny apartment, her future uncertain. "I'm not here to apologize again," Maria said once they were seated. "I know sorry isn't enough. I know I broke something that can't be fixed. But I want you to know that I'm keeping the baby. Whatever happens, whatever you and Richard decide, I'm going to be a mother." Victoria studied her across the small table. She wanted to hate this woman, and part of her did. But she also saw in Maria something she recognized. A human being who had made terrible choices for understandable reasons. Not excusable reasons, perhaps, but understandable ones. "Does he know?" Victoria asked. "About your intentions?" "He wants me to." Maria's voice broke. "He says it would be easier. For everyone. He offered to pay for everything, to make sure I was taken care of afterward. But I can't. This baby is all I have now." In that moment, Victoria made a decision that surprised even herself. She reached across the table and took Maria's hand, a gesture so unexpected that both women's eyes filled with tears. "Then you're going to need help," Victoria said quietly. "Not from me directly. I can't. I'm not capable of that kind of generosity yet. But I won't abandon you to deal with this alone. My mother has connections. We'll find you a job, somewhere you can work until the baby comes. And there will be a trust fund for the child. Nothing extravagant, but enough to ensure a decent life." "Why?" Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do that for me after what I did?" "I'm not doing it for you," Victoria replied honestly. "I'm doing it for that baby. And I'm doing it for myself, because I need to be able to live with how this ends. I need to know that I didn't let my pain turn me into someone I don't recognize. Part 8. Rebuilding the divorce proceedings took 8 months to finalize. It was contentious and expensive and exhausting in ways Victoria hadn't anticipated. Richard fought for every piece of art, every investment, every share of stock. His affair had destroyed his reputation, cost him his position at the firm, and alienated most of their social circle. He was angry and defensive, lashing out at everyone around him. But Victoria held firm. She kept the mansion, most of the liquid assets, and her dignity. She refused to engage in mudslinging, despite her lawyer's advice that public sympathy would be on her side. She made no statements to the press, attended no interviews, simply moved forward with quiet determination. Maria gave birth to a daughter, Sophia, on a cold February morning. Elizabeth Whitmore was the one who called to tell Victoria, as she had maintained contact with Maria throughout the pregnancy, arranging medical care and ensuring she had everything she needed. Richard had shown up at the hospital, Elizabeth reported, looking shell-shocked and overwhelmed. He held his daughter for 20 minutes and then left, promising to figure things out, but clearly having no idea how to do that. Victoria didn't visit. She sent a gift, a silver rattle that had been in the Whitmore family for generations, but she couldn't bring herself to see the child. Not yet, maybe not ever. Some wounds were too deep to heal completely. Instead, she threw herself into rebuilding her own life. She sold the mansion. Too many memories, too many ghosts in those marble halls, and bought a smaller place in the city. She focused on her charity work, discovering that helping others provided a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life of societal obligations. She started therapy, something she would never have considered before. In the quiet of her therapist's office, she began to unpack not just the betrayal but the entire architecture of her life. The expectations she had internalized without question. The performance of perfection that had left no room for authentic connection. The ways she had been complicit in the death of her marriage long before Richard's affair. You can't control what happened, her therapist told her in one session. But you can control who you become because of it. Part 9. Unexpected encounters. 18 months after the divorce was finalized, Victoria ran into Maria at a farmer's market. It was completely by chance. Victoria had taken up cooking, finding meditation in the process of creating meals from scratch. And there was Maria, Sophia strapped to her chest in a carrier, examining tomatoes with the kind of careful attention that spoke of a tight budget. They saw each other at the same moment, and for a heartbeat, Victoria considered turning and walking away. But something made her stay, made her walk over to the woman who had upended her life. "Hello, Maria," she said quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore," Maria replied, then corrected herself. "Victoria." "Hello." Sophia chose that moment to wake up, her dark eyes blinking in the afternoon sunlight. She was beautiful, Victoria noted with a pang. She had Richard's nose, but Maria's eyes and mouth. "She's lovely," Victoria said, surprising herself with the sincerity in her voice. "Thank you," Maria replied. "For everything. The job your mother helped me find, the trust fund. You didn't have to do any of that." "Maybe not," Victoria agreed. "But I needed to. For my own peace, if nothing else." They talked for a few minutes, carefully, like people navigating a minefield. Maria was working as a translator now, using her English and Spanish to help immigrant families navigate bureaucracy. It was work she found meaningful, she said, though the pay wasn't great. She was living with her aunt, saving money to eventually get her own place. Richard was engaged again, Maria mentioned. To someone from his own social circle this time, a widow with no children of her own. He saw Sophia once a month, sending child support checks but never quite managing to build a real relationship with his daughter. "I think he's ashamed," Maria said softly, "of what he did, of how it all turned out. He can't look at her without seeing the wreckage of his choices." Victoria nodded, understanding that sentiment all too well. "That's his loss," she said. "She deserves better than a father who can't face his own mistakes." As they said goodbye, exchanging polite wishes for each other's continued well-being, Victoria felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, exactly. She wasn't sure she would ever fully forgive Maria, and she certainly hadn't forgiven Richard. But acceptance, perhaps, an acknowledgement that they were all just flawed human beings doing their best to move forward from the wreckage of their choices. Part 10. Moving forward 2 years after the confrontation in the marble hallway, Victoria stood in the living room of her new home, surrounded by people she had come to know in her post-divorce life. There were women from the volunteer organization she had joined, colleagues from the foundation she now ran full-time, and her therapist, who had become a friend as well as a professional advisor. They were celebrating the launch of a new initiative Victoria had spent months developing, a support program for women going through difficult divorces, particularly those who found themselves suddenly needing to rebuild their lives from scratch. It combined legal assistance, therapy, job training, and practical support, everything Victoria wished she had known she needed when her own world fell apart. Her mother was there too, looking proud in a way that made Victoria's chest tight with emotion. Elizabeth had been her rock through all of this, offering tough love and practical advice in equal measure. She had taught Victoria that grace under pressure wasn't about maintaining a perfect facade. It was about facing reality head-on and dealing with it, no matter how painful. As Victoria gave a short speech about the program's goals, she found herself thinking about Maria. She had heard through the grapevine that Maria was thriving. She had started her own translation business and was making a name for herself in the immigrant advocacy community. Sophia was 3 now, apparently bright and spirited, a little girl who would grow up knowing she was loved, even if her origins were complicated. Victoria had also heard that Richard's new marriage was struggling. Apparently, he had brought all his old patterns into the new relationship, and his new wife wasn't tolerating them the way Victoria had for so many years. There was a small, petty part of Victoria that found satisfaction in that news, but mostly she just felt sad. Sad for all the wasted years, for all the pain that could have been avoided if any of them had been brave enough to be honest about what they wanted and needed. But she was also grateful. Grateful that the betrayal had forced her to examine her life, to rebuild from the ground up, to discover who she was when stripped of all the expectations and performances that had defined her for so long. She was stronger now, more authentic, more connected to her own truth. She had even started dating. Nothing serious yet, but she was learning how to be vulnerable with another person, how to build a relationship based on genuine connection rather than social expectations. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Epilogue. Years later. 5 years after that fateful afternoon, Victoria received an unexpected letter. It was from Maria, written in careful, formal language that suggested she had drafted it many times before finding the courage to send it. Sophia was starting kindergarten, the letter explained, and they were working on a family tree project. Sophia had questions about her father's side of the family, questions that Richard, who had largely faded from their lives, couldn't or wouldn't answer. Maria was writing to ask if Victoria would be willing to meet Sophia someday, to tell her about the Whitmore family history, to help fill in some of the gaps. "I know I have no right to ask this of you," Maria wrote. "You owe us nothing, but Sophia deserves to know where she comes from, and you are the keeper of those stories. If you can't do this, I understand. But I had to ask." Victoria set the letter down and walked to the window of her home office, looking out at the city below. The request stirred up old pain, but it didn't devastate her the way it might have years ago. She had done enough healing to see the situation for what it was: a child seeking to understand her own identity, and a mother trying to help her do that. She thought about it for 3 days before responding. When she finally did, her answer surprised her. "I'm willing to meet Sophia," she wrote back. "But let's start slowly. Maybe lunch somewhere neutral. I can't promise to be part of her life in any significant way, but I can answer questions about family history. That much, at least, I can do." The lunch, when it finally happened, was awkward but not as painful as Victoria had feared. Sophia was a delightful child, curious, bright, and remarkably perceptive for 5 years old. She asked Victoria about the mansion, about the grandmother she barely knew. Elizabeth had passed away the year before, about what her father was like when he was younger. Victoria answered honestly but carefully, neither demonizing Richard nor painting him as something he wasn't. She told stories about the Whitmore family, about the business her great-grandfather had built, about the values that had shaped generations. And she found, to her surprise, that she could look at this child, the living reminder of the worst betrayal of her life, and see not a symbol of pain but simply a little girl trying to understand herself. They met a few more times over the following year, always briefly, always in neutral spaces. Victoria wasn't ready to be Aunt Victoria or to take on any formal role in Sophia's life. But she could be a resource, a link to a past that was rightfully part of Sophia's heritage, even if the circumstances of her birth were complicated. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Victoria had come to realize that forgiveness was overrated, something people demanded without understanding how hard it actually was to grant. But it was something: acceptance, maybe, or simply the ability to see past her own pain, to acknowledge the humanity of everyone involved. She still had hard days, moments when the memory of that afternoon in the marble hallway would hit her with unexpected force. But those moments grew fewer and further between. Her life was full now, full of meaningful work, genuine friendships, and the hard-won knowledge that she could survive anything and come out stronger on the other side. The mansion had new owners now, a young family who filled it with laughter and life. Sometimes Victoria drove past it, looking up at the white columns and remembering the woman she had been when she lived there. That Victoria seemed like a stranger now, perfectly groomed, perfectly mannered, perfectly miserable beneath her perfectly maintained facade. This Victoria, older, more careworn, but infinitely more authentic, was someone she actually liked. Someone who had faced the worst and found strength she didn't know she possessed. Someone who had learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are also the things that set us free. As she drove away from the mansion for what would be the last time, Victoria caught her reflection in the rearview mirror and smiled. It was a real smile, not the practiced one she had perfected over years of social obligation. And in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that despite everything, despite the betrayal, the pain, the long hard road of recovery, she was going to be all right. More than all right, actually. She was going to thrive.